That's also good. Let me get this thing working because I don't think you see my screen anymore. So let me wait a second. Sorry for this. Um, okay, so I think you can see my screen now. Is that okay?
Yeah, it's better right
Yes?
now. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Thank you for the introduction, Alpha. It's a pleasure to be able to talk to you this afternoon or morning here. And I have fond memories of Erlangen University because I also visited there 2 years ago in September for 2 weeks, and that was very nice. Everyone was so kind. I have very fond memories of that. Also meeting a lot of people, maybe also some people who are here today. Um, and talking about research, and I was really impressed with a lot of things that I saw there, and I'm happy to be invited again to talk about something specifically about a paper that I am working on together with my colleague Bay here at the University of Amsterdam. And the paper is about scenario-based experiments and specifically about the design of such experiments, where an important design question is whether you should frame the scenario and also the questions that you ask about the scenario in the first person or in the third person. And we see that there's often third person framing because research believe that this will take care of social desirability bias. And what we wanted to do in this paper, in this study, is find out whether that is indeed true. And um, I guess that after running two studies that I'm going to talk about, two experiments that we did to answer this question, I think we are actually left with more questions than we had at the beginning and relatively few answers. So if you're here primarily to learn how you should design such experiments, then I'm afraid I'll point you because I learned a lot from working on this study, but I don't think that we really have the answer to the question that you see here on the sheets yet. So we're also, in a way, a little bit stuck with this research project in the sense that we don't really know how to proceed. And also, I'm very happy also to take questions. So I realize I have about 1 hour to talk about the paper, but I'm very happy to also answer questions or take comments during the presentation, even though there's also some time at the end of the session. But feel free to ask me anything while I'm talking. Okay, so let's get started with a little bit what the story is behind the project. Um, Bay and I, so my colleague with whom I'm working on this paper, we had a paper that we did together, a study that we did together, published in the journal Management Accounting Research in 2023, which used a scenario. And in that paper, we uh, used the following scenario, which was framed in the third person. So it was about the participants were asked to imagine a story about a gentleman called Mark. Mark is the director of a regional office at ABC Incorporated, blah, 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 and Mark has to make a decision, and then we ask them to predict what Mark would do. Because this is this standard procedure of taking care of social desirability bias. You don't ask people, what would you do? You ask them, what would someone else do? Because the idea is that if people predict other people's behavior, then that is more informative about how they themselves would behave than if you ask them to predict their own behavior. I'll get back to that fundamental thing in a couple of minutes. But we did this scenario. We found some results. But then during the review process, as it happens, the reviewers and the editor asked us to run a different version of the same experiment, but now in the first person. So rather than having people read this story and then asking them, what do you think Mark will do in the current situation? In the second experiment, we had the same scenario, but now framed in the first person, where they read, imagine that you are the director of a regional office, blah, blah, blah. And so rather than Mark, they read about themselves, and then we asked them, what would you do in the current situation? And we found results that were similar, but not exactly the same. And we were confused. What's the best way to do it? Should you ask about the third person, or should you ask these things in the first person? So we read about that. We tried to find papers that were discussing that were giving guidelines there, and we basically found that there was nothing there. But at the same time, that if you look at all these scenario-based experiments out there in the accounting literature, that people do all sorts of different things without apparently being informed or having even very carefully thought about what they would be doing. So that is really the start of this research project. We wanted to, for once and for all, essentially get an answer to what is the best way of framing a scenario, or does it even matter how you frame that scenario, that vignette in your experiment. Okay, so this issue of social desirability bias is particularly an issue in any setting where the decision that you're interested in as a researcher is a decision about of what we call a false moral dilemma, a situation where you're interested in how individuals behave in a setting where they need to choose between doing something that's in their own best interest versus something that's in the interest of someone else, one other person, the organization for which they work, maybe society as a whole. So, for example, situations where you would ask whether managers would engage in earnings management, which is good for them. They make more money, but obviously that's an unethical thing to do. Or resource allocation decisions by middle managers where they need to choose between allocating resources to a project that is best for themselves versus a project that is best for the firm. Or in an auditing setting, there's a lot of research on whether an auditor would be willing to accept a proposed reporting method by a client that is really quite aggressive versus would they push the client towards accounting for something in a more conservative and perhaps also more appropriate manner. So there's a lot of behavioral accounting research that focuses on these types of dilemmas and try to understand which factors influence how people behave in such dilemma situations. And the problem with that research is that individuals who participate in such studies may tend to respond in socially desirable ways. So rather than being honest about how they would behave if they were in such a situation, they would try to make a more positive picture of themselves than accurately respond to how they would behave. But very few people would indicate that, yes, indeed, I would manage earnings, or yes, indeed, I would do this thing that's good for me, but not for the firm, or yes, I would probably just go along with the client because otherwise things can get annoying. Yeah, and that social desirability issue, of course, poses a potential validity threat for this research, because if people are unwilling to admit that they would do bad things, then we're going to get very little variation in the dependent variable, and therefore there will be very little to explain. Also, if people are not honest about their engagement in bad behavior, then cause-effect relationships might be obscured in the sense that spurious relationships could be created, or real relations out there in the real world are suppressed, and we will just be unable to find such relationships even though they are there. And then, right, the solution that has often been proposed to tackle this issue of social desirability bias is third-person framing, because the idea is that if you don't ask people to predict what they themselves would do, but what someone else would do, then the social desirability goes away, because people are willing, have no problem with making the prediction about someone else. And then the underlying idea is that how you predict that someone else would behave, this third person would behave, that is informative about how you yourself would actually behave in that dilemma situation. Right. So these third person frames are supposed to be less affected by social desirability than your first person, or actually I should say second person, right? Because the question would then typically be posed, what would you do? How do second person vignettes are framed? That might work. The question simply is we don't know. So there's very little empirical evidence. As I said, we searched for it. There basically is no empirical evidence out there. So no one had to really study that before we did it, proving that such third-person frames indeed tackle the social desirability bias problem. And at the same time, we know that third-person framing also has downsides, because obviously if you ask people to predict what someone else would do rather than what they would do, that brings in all sorts of noise, because now they are explicitly perhaps thinking about another person, a specific other person perhaps besides themselves, and right, you're introducing all this additional noise that might not improve the inferences that you can draw from your experiments. So to the upsides, the mitigation of social desirability bias outweigh the downsides that we know are there. That's what we tried to figure out in this study. So let's make this a little bit more concrete for people who are not doing vignette studies or scenario-based experiments. We already saw this example in the very beginning, but here in a little bit more systematic way, right? So both the vignette itself, so the story itself, and the question that you ask about the story to measure your dependent variable can be framed in either the second person or the third person. So in the second person, you would ask someone, for example, imagine you are an accountant, right? And then you tell the story, but it's about you. Right? And you would also ask at the very end to measure your dependent variable, what would you do in this situation? And in the third person, the same story could, for example, be about a specific individual. So you tell them Janice is an accountant, or you ask people, imagine one of your peers who works as an accountant, or you start your story by saying a typical accountant, and then always the same story, but it's not explicitly about you, it's about someone else, it's about a third person. And then you ask people to predict what that other person, Janice or your peer or the accountant or whatever you used, what they would do in that specific setting. Right, so that's in essence the difference between second person and third person framing. And then the funny thing is, if you look in the literature how these frames are used, then you see that often a second person vignette is used with a second person question, and a third person vignette is used with a third person question. But we also sometimes see mixes. So there are some published studies out there that use a second person vignette, but then ask a third person question, and also the other way around. So people who would use a third person vignette and then ask people, what would you do in this situation? Right, so this all seems to be something that people didn't really think about when they were designing their studies. It doesn't seem that there is a lot of deliberate strategy behind the specific frames that people use, besides this vague idea that using third-person frames will tackle the social desirability bias issue. But we very rarely see that people explicitly discuss in their paper why they use the second person or a third-person frame. So there is a lot of this is a research method, these vignette studies, scenario experiments that are used a lot in all sorts of fields, not only in accounting. We see it in all sorts of business disciplines, business ethics, marketing. It's also very common in education and in healthcare, right, where doctors are asked to think about situations that they might be in with patients, etc., and how they would behave in such settings. And all over the place, we see sometimes second-person frames and sometimes third-person frames, rarely without any with a deep discussion about why a certain frame was chosen. So these vignette studies, they vary along all sorts of dimensions, and now I'm specifically focusing on the accounting literature. So, for example, some are very long, right? A vignette can be 2 or 3 pages long, but it can also just be 2 or 3 sentences, as we will be doing in this paper. Some studies in one experiment, they only use 1 vignette, as we're going to do, but there's also papers where participants read 2 or 3 or 5 or even 10 vignettes within the same experiment. And then, of course, there are all sorts of different topics and dependent variables that these vignettes are combined with. So that requires a little bit more detail. First, there are vignettes that are used in all sorts of experiments that are not touching upon any moral questions. So in such situations, social desirability is not an issue, right? If you ask people about a setting where there's no appropriate or inappropriate behavior or ethical versus unethical behavior, then social desirability is not a cause for concern. But in many of these studies, especially in accounting, there is a moral dimension to the decision that researchers are interested in. So, for example, we see this type of research investigating things like you see here on the sheet, auditors' acceptance of a client's aggressive reporting, escalation of commitment, where a manager needs to choose to continue a particular line of research or a particular line of investments, for example, to save face, even though they are apparently not very successful, and it would be in the interest of the firm if they would stop with their current trajectory of actions. There's a lot of research on when managers are honestly reporting, if they also have incentives to misreport. Earnings management is a specific accounting form related to reporting honesty, of course. Resource allocation, advice giving, whistleblowing. These are all areas where someone, an accountant or a manager or an investor, needs to make a decision where they need to choose between doing what's in their own interest and what is more appropriate, more ethical, better for society, something like that. And if you look at how the question is asked in these experiments, you see that there are different operationalization. So sometimes you see people asking, how likely are you to engage in a specific type of behavior? How appropriate is a certain type of behavior? And sometimes they're also asked to give a numerical answer. So for example, what is the minimum amount that you think the client should report in an auditing setting? So yeah, let's look at a few more specific examples. So that everyone knows what we are talking about. Let me skip this quickly for the sake of time. So here's an old paper, 1997, one of the first papers using a scenario-based experiment, which is in the third person about Chris Gibson, blah, blah, blah. You read a story about Chris, and then the dependent variable is asked in this way. Chris decides not to disclose the information. Is this what he should have done, or is this what he should not have done? And this is one way in which that dependent variable is then measured. Another example from a paper from AOS 2010, the influence of organizational justice on accountant whistleblowing. Also a third-person scenario about a guy called Alex Miller. So you read the story about Alex, and then the dependent variable is, after reading the core scenario and manipulations, the participants answered the following question. In your opinion, what is the likelihood that Alex will report the CFO to an appropriate person within the corporation? And then that's scored on a scale of 1 to 9. So this is third-person vignette plus a third-person question. And the idea, of course, is that if you score higher on this, then actually, if you would be in that situation, you would also be more likely to report a colleague to another person in the corporation. Right? That's always what we're after. We're interested in what people themselves would do. But the question is just, should we ask them what they would do, or should we ask them what another person would be doing? Because that's more informative about how they themselves would behave. One more example from my own recent paper with my colleagues Gary and Marcel in the accounting review, where we have a story, and this is in the second person. So we used in this experiment the second person frame. Assume you are a team manager at a call center, blah, blah, blah. You all read about yourself. Imagine that you would be in that setting. And then we asked them in the end, how likely is it that you would recommend Amy for the new team? So second person vignette with a second person question. And then there are also other combinations, sometimes third person vignette, second person question, etc., etc. So it's all over the place, but no prior studies have explicitly examined whether these different frames affect responses in meaningful ways, and specifically whether framing affects more responses to morally sensitive situations more strongly than responses to morally neutral situations, and whether these framing effects are due to the framing of the vignette or of the question, or maybe of a combination of the two. So we think that's an important research gap, because there's so much research being done using this methodology, and apparently most research simply don't know what is the best way to go about in this setting. So what we wanted to do in our study is answer these questions, essentially. We didn't have any hypothesis, because we're really going into this with an open mind, wanting to know the answer to these questions, and having no theory about what to expect, except that we know that it's common practice to use these third person frames, but it doesn't matter at all. So we asked the questions: do research participants respond in a more socially desirable way to a morally sensitive dilemma if the vignette is framed in the second person, as opposed to the third person? And we asked the same about the question: do research participants respond in a more socially desirable way to morally sensitive dilemma if the question about the response is framed in the second person as opposed to the third person? And finally, we ask whether there's an interaction between the two, because it's possible that the social desirability bias only kicks in if both the vignette and the question are framed in the second person, and that having either of the two being framed in the third person already takes care of that problem. So only if it's only about you, then you get the social desirable answer, and perhaps if one of the two is framed in the third person, that might be enough to get rid of the social desirability bias. Okay, how do we do it? We ran an experiment with a 2 by 2 by 2 between subjects design, where we manipulated the framing of the vignette, second person versus third person, and the framing of the question, second person versus third person. And then finally, we also manipulated the moral sensitivity of the scenario, because we wanted to ensure that if we find any differences due to framing, then that is because of the social desirability bias and not some other effect that framing might have on people's responses. So what we needed to have in our experiment is a scenario that can be both morally sensitive and not morally sensitive. The same scenario, two versions of it. And if it's really about social desirability bias, then we should see that only when the setting described is morally sensitive, do we see an effect of framing. If the situation is morally neutral, so there is no reason why there would be social desirability bias in the first place, we should also not see any effects of framing. So that's why we need two versions of the scenario, one that's morally sensitive and one that is not. So the way we do this, we have a very short scenario in our experiment where we describe a situation where the person, the protagonist in the scenario, finds a dollar bill in the restroom of a movie theater, and then we ask them what they would do with that dollar bill, whether they would pocket it for themselves to spend it later or not. Um, and we vary the moral sensitivity of this scenario by changing the denomination of the dollar bill. So it's either $1 or it's $100. And the idea is that, right, finding $1 and then pocketing it is something that few people would find completely unacceptable or very unethical. This is just something that might happen. It's just $1. But finding $100 and then pocketing it for yourself, that is something that most people, or at least a larger group of people, would find a morally difficult thing to do. So there will be people who think that's still appropriate, but many people would think this is inappropriate. If you find $100, you should bring that to in this case, in our scenario in the movie theater, you should bring that to someone at a desk in the theater. Okay, so here are the specific scenarios that we use in the second person frame and in the third person frame. So in the second person frame, the people read, you walk into the restroom of a movie theater and see and then depending on the moral sensitivity condition, either a $1 or a $100 bill lying under the sink. You pick it up and look around to see if there's anyone who might have lost the bill, but you don't see anyone. All stalls in the restroom are vacant, and it appears you're the only one there. And then in the third person frame, the same scenario, but now in the third person, a person walks into the restroom of a movie theater and sees a $1 or $100 bill lying under the sink. The person picks it up, looks around to see if there's anyone who might have lost the bill, but does not see anyone. All stalls in the restroom are vacant, and it appears that the person is the only one there. And then looking at the question, in the second person framing question, we ask them, what would you do in this situation? And in the third person framing of the question, we ask them, what would a person do in this situation? Right? And then we look at all four combinations. So not only second person vignette with second person question and third with third, but also second with third and third with second. Right? So all four possible combinations. The answer scale always stays the same, a 7-point Likert scale. With the following anchors: 1, definitely not pocket the money to spend it later. 7, definitely pocket the money to spend it later. Right? And what we would expect if indeed framing takes care of social desirability bias, and the social desirability bias would appear here in the sense that people would be unwilling to admit that they would take the $100 bill themselves, right? Because they would feel that's unethical, so they would try to paint a picture of themselves that's more favorable than justified. That we would observe more social desirability, so more similar answers in the second person framing condition compared to the third person framing condition, where people are not saying what they themselves would do or not thinking about themselves, but about the third person. Okay, so we pre-registered everything. the data collection and analysis procedures. We collect our participants from the online website Prolific. We have 1,200 participants in the experiment, so that's 150 per experimental cell. We really wanted to have a large sample so that we have a real powerful test for our research questions. And we held a few things constant. So we only used people who were based in the United States, have English as their first language, are at least 21 years old, have an approval rate on this Prolific website of 95% or higher. So they're reliable participants, and also had a minimum of 30 prior submissions on Prolific. So no new people there, people who knew what they were doing. And we also asked for a gender balanced sample, so an equal proportion of male and female participants. Okay. Then, as it happens, if you do 7 and we disregard these observations, which means that we end up with 1,121 observations in total. And a first thing that we needed to do is to check whether our manipulation of social sensitivity or moral sensitivity, whether that worked. So we did a very simple question. We asked all the participants the scenario that you read described a difficult, morally sensitive dilemma, and participants needed to indicate to what extent they agreed with that statement. And we find that, as expected, participants in the $100 condition were more likely to agree to this statement than participants in the $1 condition, right? So people who read that they or a person found $100 felt that they were facing a morally sensitive dilemma more strongly than people who found only a $1 in the movie theater bathroom. Also, participants in the $100 condition tend to agree with the statements, whereas participants in the $1 condition tend to disagree with the statement. And that's exactly what we want to be able to test the effects of framing, the thing that we're really interested here. Okay, so here are the descriptive statistics of our first experiments. You see the vignette framing, second person, third person, and then the question framing here second and here third. And on the horizontal axis here in the table, the two different rows, the not morally sensitive situation, so where they found $1, and the morally sensitive situation where they found $100. And if you look at the averages here, the means, those are the means on this answer scale from 1 to 7. So you see that actually in all conditions it's somewhere around 5, 6. So most people would take the money both in the $1 and the $100. And yeah, there's some variation across the framing conditions, but what we don't see and what we would expect if there were serious social desirability issues is that if everything, or at least one thing, is framed in the second person, that the extent to which people agree would be much lower than in a situation where it's about a third person, and we don't really see that happening here. In fact, if you look at the, and these are the means. If we look at the results, say that's vignette framing and question framing would both reduce social desirability bias. Right? I mean, a third person framing would, the vignette and the question would both lead to a reduction in social desirability bias. Then the pattern of our result of the means would look something like this. If there's a $1 bill, so a not morally sensitive situation, how the vignette and the question are framed should not matter at all. But in the morally sensitive situation, we would expect not only that people would be less likely to pocket the money, right? They would be less likely to take the $100 than the $1, but we would also expect that the framing matters. Both the question frame and the the vignette frame and perhaps both. So this is actually what the results would look like if all three of our research questions, so the vignette frame, the question frame, and the interaction would all be answered affirmatively. So if they would all have an effect on participants' answers. But that is not at all what our real results look like. As you can see here, this is what we actually find in our study. So completely different from what you might expect if you believe that framing reduces, social desirability bias. We find that in the morally sensitive scenario, there is almost no difference between the different framing conditions. But in the not morally sensitive scenario, we do find some differences between the framing conditions, but not in a way that we really find meaningful in any way. So it's hard to interpret these results. The only thing that we can really say is that there is no evidence at all that framing a vignette or a question in the third person, or perhaps both the vignette and the question in the third person, reduces social desirability bias. So we can look at the results in a little more detail. We run a factorial ANOVA, and the first question is, does framing the vignette in the second as opposed to the third person matter? So we need to look at the moral sensitivity times vignette framing interaction, and that is not at all significant. We find that this effect is significant. Moral sensitivity times vignette framing is significant when the question is framed in the second person and not when the question is framed in the third person. And you see, we do find a significant three-way interaction here. So there's definitely something going on in the data, but everything that's going on is going on here in the not morally sensitive version of the scenario, where we did not expect anything to happen, and we should not expect anything to happen if this has anything to do with social desirability. The second research question asks about whether the framing of the question matters. So if we look at the results there, we need to look at this line here, moral sensitivity times question framing. Again, we find that this is not significant, right? So now I'm going a little bit too fast here. Let me go back. Right now we're looking at these two gray lines here. But again, we have this third three-way interaction. So actually the interaction between moral sensitivity and question framing is significant when the scenario is framed in the third person, but not when the vignette is framed in the second person. Which you see right here, the difference between these points and these points. Okay, and then finally the interaction effect. I already told you, right? We have this three-way interaction, so the effect of vignette framing depends on question framing and the other way around, and that in turn on the moral sensitivity. But yeah, again, this is not in the way that we had expected it, right? Here we see differences in the not morally sensitive condition, but we see no differences between the framing in the morally sensitive condition, which is exactly opposite of what we had expected in the first place. So we had hoped for clear answers that would help us in the future, not only us, but also other researchers, to make a decision about whether it's better to use a second person frame or a third person frame, or more specifically, whether third person framing of either the vignette or the question would reduce social desirability bias. But we find no evidence at all that matters. And yeah, that's what I said. We left probably with more questions than answers after running this study. We control for a lot of things. We look at other additional analysis. We look at whether there matters, if we're talking about men or women, has no effect. We also asked people whether they had ever been in that situation of finding money and then needing to make a decision on whether to bring it to some authority or to keep it for themselves. That doesn't affect the conclusions of our study. We also included SDS-17, which is an instrument that measures the tendency of an individual to respond in a socially desirable way to questions about with moral sensitivity. If we include that in our analysis, still we find no effect in it. And we don't find any meaningful patterns. So that's where we are. We wrote the paper, we presented it a couple of times in seminars like this, and then we thought, okay, probably the only way to make any sense of this is to run an additional experiment, because one possibility is that the scenario that we looked at, right, finding the money in the bathroom, that even in the $100 condition, that scenario was not morally sensitive enough for people to not be willing to admit that they would engage in the behavior of just taking that money, right? Even in this in the second person vignette and second person question condition, so the condition where you would expect social desirability bias to be strongest. Even in that condition, we find that a large majority of participants in our experiment said that they would just take the money. So apparently they were not afraid to admit that they would do something that is generally considered, or at least we thought, ethically unacceptable. So maybe that's why we find no meaningful variation. So our reasoning was, then let's use a different scenario of which prior research suggests that people find it morally sensitive and that they have difficulties making a choice there. And even more specific, a prior paper, Chung and Monroe 2003, suggests for this scenario that it is affected by social desirability bias. So we take this scenario of which we know that people respond in a socially desirable way, and then make a morally neutral version of that scenario, and then basically do the same experiment again. 2 by 2 by 2, morally sensitive versus not morally sensitive, vignette framing second person versus third person, and question framing second person versus third person. This scenario describes a situation where a credit manager at a bank needs to decide whether to provide a loan to a friend who asks for a loan from that bank. Here is the scenario in the second person frame and in the third person frame. So in the second person frame, it says a promising new company applies for a loan at a bank. You are the credit manager at the bank and a friend of the company's owner. And here you see in blue the moral sensitivity scenario manipulation that we use. Because of the new company's short credit history, it does not meet the bank's normal lending criteria. And that is the traditional version of the scenario that poses a morally sensitive situation, because on the one hand you want to help your friend, but on the other hand your friend's company does not meet the bank's normal lending criteria, so you need to choose, are you helping your friend even if that's not good for the firm? And we also created a morally neutral version of the same scenario, and that is where we replace this blue sentence with the green sentence. Despite the new company's short credit history, it meets the bank's normal lending criteria. So in this scenario, the moral sensitivity should be gone, because there's absolutely no reason why you should not grant the loan to that company, because it just meets all the lending criteria. Right? So we would not expect social desirability to play any role in that kind of situation where the bank, where the company does meet all the criteria for getting a loan. Okay, so this is the second person frame. Third person frame is exactly the same. The only thing that we are changing is that we are replacing the words "you are" with the word "the credit manager." You are the credit manager, and here we just say the credit manager at the bank is a friend of the company's owner. Right? So that's the way in which we manipulate the vignette frame. Then, of course, we also manipulate the question framing again. Second person, we ask how likely is it that you would recommend extending the loan to the new company? And in the third person frame of the question, we ask how likely is it that the credit manager would recommend extending the loan to the new company? And we measure the dependent variable on this 7-point Likert scale, running from extremely unlikely to extremely likely. All right, so that's the scenario you see. It's similar to the first experiment, except that now we are using a scenario that has proven to be affected by social desirability, right? In the blue version, we created the green version as a version of the scenario where there should be no social desirability issue. All right, so we ran this experiment again on Prolific with 800 participants, so that's about 100 per experimental condition. Basically the same group of people, or not the same people, but the same profiles as for the first experiment. Again, a gender balanced sample. If we look at the results, we again have some people who don't meet our attention checks, so we remove them from the sample as we pre-registered, and we're left with 745 observations. And again, we need to see through a manipulation check whether the moral sensitivity manipulation was effective, and it was. So we see that participants in the morally sensitive the criteria for the company are not met condition were more likely to agree that the scenario described a difficult morally sensitive dilemma than people who met at who read that the bank that the company had met the criteria. Right? In this case, there is basically no morally sensitive dilemma that you would face. So we also see that participants in the morally sensitive condition where the criteria are not met tend to agree with the statement, and those in the morally neutral condition tend to disagree with the statement. All good, right? So in that sense, this all worked again, like in the first experiment. But here are the results. This is not in the paper yet, so if you maybe read the paper before, this second experiment is not in it yet. We're working on it right now to integrate it with the first experiment, because the results are slightly different. So what we find is, and this is good, but we wanted that, we expected that in the morally neutral version of the scenario where the company met all the criteria, that the mean on the dependent variable, right, the likelihood of extending the loan is much higher than in the morally sensitive version of the scenario where the company did not meet the criteria. But yeah, that is sort of promising, because now it shows that we have manipulated the moral sensitivity effectively, such that it also affected the dependent variable. So this really is a situation where people think I probably should not do this, right? You see also in all conditions except for the third person condition, this is also below the middle point of the answer scale, indicating that people would unlikely extend the loan. That's all nice, but of course what we're mainly interested in is in the effect of framing again. And now things get a little bit more mysterious. So this is just straight out of R, so the picture here is a bit basic. But what you see here is a three-way interaction plot. This on the left-hand side is the insense condition, meaning the not morally sensitive condition where the company met the criteria. And this is the condition where there is moral sensitivity, so the company did not meet the criteria, right? But in both cases, it's your friend that you want to help. So what would you do, or what would someone else do? Yeah, we see this difference here that I just spoke about, right? So on average, the dependent variable is definitely lower in the morally sensitive version of the scenario compared to the insensitive version of the scenario. For the rest, if you look at the pattern, you see that it's pretty similar across the two situations. So if you would look at the statistics, which I'll do in a second, then actually the red lines even though they are downward sloping, are not significantly downward sloping. So you could see these as flat lines. And also the red lines, the red dots are equal to this blue dot. So actually what I'm saying is that in both the morally sensitive version of the scenario and the insensitive version, there's one condition, the condition where both the vignette and the question are framed in the third person that stands out compared to the other three conditions where at least one thing is framed in the second person. Okay, so if you look at the factorial ANOVA, we again find this three-way interaction, and we also find a significant interaction between vignette framing and question framing that's even more significant. So yes, we do find here that framing matters, because if the question and the vignette are both framed in the third person, then the behavior of extending the loan is perceived as being much more likely than in any of the other three conditions where at least one of the two things or both of them are framed in the second person. But does that signal that this third person framing is taking care of the social desirability bias? No, that cannot be the case, right? Because we find the same pattern in both the morally sensitive condition and the not morally sensitive condition. So if it were social desirability bias, we would not expect any framing effects in the insensitive condition. Only in the morally sensitive condition would we expect this pattern, but not here. And given the fact that we find the same pattern in both conditions, it signals clearly that there is something happening with these frames. You get different answers if you frame both the scenario and the question in the third person. But it doesn't seem to be that is because of third person framing taking care of the social desirability bias. Something else is going on, but what it is, we don't know. We're thinking about that right now on how to proceed. Concluding, we find no evidence that vignette framing or question framing decreases social desirability. There is some evidence that it does have an effect, especially in the second experiment. We find some clear evidence that if you frame both the question and the vignette in the third person, you get a higher likelihood of the behavior, but that has nothing to do with social desirability, because we find the exact same thing in a completely morally neutral situation. Yeah, and that just raises all sorts of questions. So we probably need to do more research, more experiments before we can conclude any definitive things about whether framing matters, and if so, how. And I guess until that time, if you need to, if you want to do a study like this with a morally sensitive scenario, a false moral dilemma, should you use a second person or third person framing? I wish I would know. If I knew do it myself, I probably would go for second person, because there's no clear evidence that third person framing takes care of the social desirability bias. But actually, from doing both these studies, I'm getting serious doubts whether social desirability bias really exists in experiments like this. So one thing that I only recently found out is that there actually is very little evidence that social desirability is a problem in the first place in scenario-based experiments. Most of the evidence for social desirability bias comes from survey research where they ask people about their everyday behavior, but not from hypothetical scenarios that people respond to. So maybe that would be the overall conclusion, that we shouldn't worry too much about social desirability bias in our accounting experiments using scenarios. But even that is tentative conclusion. We just need to do more research, and we're not really sure where to go from here. So maybe you can help us with that. I'm for sure that you have some questions for me, even if I have raised more questions than I answered. Thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer questions or discuss or we'll see. So I'll stop sharing the screen.
Okay, thank you very much for the great lecture and your sharing story of your research, Professor Maas. Or can I call you Dr. Victor or what else? Okay, so based on your story, uh, actually, it is very important to us to decide whether we are going to use the first person, second person, third person, using different vignette or using creative question or whatsoever. So, because designing such a thing actually will create different reaction to the participants. Is that correct, Professor?
I'm sorry, Alpha. I had some minor computer issues, so I didn't really get the question. I had to, but now I'm back again. So would you be so kind to repeat the question?
Okay, okay. So
Sorry.
my question is, do you think it is very important for us, yeah, if we are going to decide or the person, the vignette, and also the question when we are doing the our research of experiment, yeah, especially in designing the scenario. So since your research has or cannot prove anything about the different things of person and vignette, so what do you think about this? Do you think people still need to uh, decide which kind of a person or which kind of vignette or what else for that? What do you think about it?
Yeah, I mean that of course is the exact question that we try to answer, and basically we're
Yeah.
unable to answer. But I think ultimately we are interested in what people themselves would be doing, right? Not what they think that other people would be doing. So I think the default should be that you should just use second person framing for your vignettes and for your questions, unless
Mhm.
there is a good reason to
This is
use
according to
third
our
person
issue, right?
frame. Sorry.
This is according to our issue or topics of our research, right?
Yes and no. I think the there rarely is a good reason to use a third person frame. I
Mm-hmm.
think in general, just using the second person frame, even in a morally sensitive scenario, is probably the best thing, because there's so little evidence that social desirability is a concern in the first place, and then there's also little evidence that third person framing would take care of the social desirability bias,
Mm-hmm.
um, based on what we show here. So I personally would not use a third person frame if I would do a morally sensitive dilemma, and if I would have a morally neutral dilemma situation scenario, then
Mm-hmm.
I would definitely never use third person framing.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much for your explanation. All right, everyone. So we are going to enter the QA session and discussion. For this session, I will divide into two rounds. First rounds, I give an opportunity for the person or anyone who want to share their question or discussion or any research or any issues that you want to discuss by raising hand. Yeah, raising hand. Okay. Anyone want to share the idea or a question? I invite 3% because according to Victor, there are three kind of person. Yeah, first, second, and third person. So I invite 3%. First, second, and third discussion. Okay. Anyone want to raise your hand and then want to ask something? Okay, Bu Nilu. Oh, okay. Bu Ocha. Hi, how are you?
Test, test. Hi, Bu Alpha. I'm good. How are you?
Hi, yeah, fine. This is
Yeah,
my
yeah, yeah.
friend Victor.
Yes.
Do you know her?
Oh,
I
so
know
sweet.
I know Ocha very well. Actually, we speak very regularly. Yeah.
Ocha is
We
in
know.
Australia right now.
I know.
Yeah. Okay, hello, Victor. How are
Okay,
you?
Hi, Ocha. Good
okay, Bu Ocha.
afternoon.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Is that my voice clear enough?
yeah, it's clear.
Yeah, clear enough. Yeah, okay. Great. So I can directly ask now, or how?
Yeah, you can.
Okay. Victor, thank you so much for the sharing session. So actually for the result is obvious, right? Maybe I agree with you about the opinion. Maybe for the survey research, it would be a problem about the social desirability bias because in the experiment it's just a role play, right? It's not directly about us, but then in the survey it's really about us. So that's why
Yeah.
social desirability bias is more concern for the survey researcher. And then I have a questions actually about your research with Beishi with about the delegation, right? So actually, what is the first reason you choose the scenario using the third names, and then why you don't just directly use the second name? Because I believe like delegation is not something that's too morally sensitive, something like that. And then the second, what I want to ask is about your decision in scenario in the delegation research. Why you choose all of the name of the gender is male? I believe like the choosing the name between male and female may create another source of bias, new bias, right? And then so that's why I observed that in your next research with Beishi about to confirm whether social desirability is the case or not, you're using like the nouns, right? The manager, that person, instead of choosing a specific name. So is that really the case? How we choose a certain name? From what from what I know, usually the other researcher trying to just randomize the name. So they create two different names, like what people it will think it's a male or female, and then randomize it and then use it as the covariate. But then for your case in the delegation, it's involved so many persons, right? And then you choose all of them is male. Is there any specific reason about it? So that's it. My questions, Victor. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ocha, for that question. Or actually, there's three questions or three things that I can talk about based on your question. Right. So first, um, yes, in that paper that I started today's presentation with, which sort of was the starting point for this whole research project, we look at delegation as a dependent variable, but it is a setting where delegation is a bit potentially unethical or morally sensitive, at least because the situation that we present to our participants there is a situation where you need to choose between doing a task yourself or delegating it to a subordinate, and the subordinate would do a better job than you, but you know that even if you do the job yourself, it's still going to be a success. So even though delegating the job to a subordinate would be better for the firm, if you do it yourself, your results are going to be a bit lower, but they're still going to be good overall. So you can then claim the credit for that success, even though the success would have been even bigger if you would have delegated the task to a subordinate. So that there is definitely a moral dimension to that delegation decision in that specific setting that we describe in that paper. Um, yeah, your other questions are also about designing scenarios a bit more broadly, right? So you're right that in that paper when we discuss about we use a third person, and indeed all the people in that scenario are male rather than female. So we thought about this. So it is something that you that you should think about. I think if you design scenarios, whether you want to do what you suggest, you could randomize that, right? And then sort of make it an additional variable, whether there's typically more than one person in a scenario. So do you want them to be both male or both female, or one male and one female, and then which of the two? So yes, you could sort of, if you're interested in gender in the first place, or you think it matters a lot, then you could vary that. But here we just wanted to keep it constant. We didn't want people to think about it too much. And we thought that probably if we just use male names, then the attention that people would have for the gender would be lowest. But it's interesting, and I don't know the answer to that question, that if we would have used female names or one male and one female names, would we have got different results? I don't know. I think I can see in a third person scenario that maybe on average people think or believe that females are a bit less unethical than males, which is probably also true. I think on average, then you would get less variation in your dependent variable if you would choose female protagonists in a scenario, because people might think that they are more likely to do the morally good thing, and we also want variation. So we also want people to think that the person would choose to do the unethical thing. So that would be a reason why maybe I would, if I would have to choose between male and female in these kind of settings, I would prefer to use male names, because otherwise I reduce the variation in the responses of people. And why did we use general names like the manager or the bank employee rather than specific names? I think we just try to keep it very general, because every specific name might, for certain people, induce specific ideas about what type of person we are dealing with. And of course, if you choose a name, you also automatically make someone male or female. So you just bring in additional issues in the experiment that we didn't want to play a role in the setting. But I can also see that in other experiments, you do want to make it more explicit, for example, because it makes it easier for people to visualize the situation that they are in, or to make it more lively to them, right? So you can call someone, what's his name? Kawan Susanto.
Yeah, I just thinking that might be problem because
Yeah.
that name. So not based on the fact that many manager majority is the male. Not obviously is that not that reason.
No, yeah,
Yeah.
I think, I don't know. I think, yeah,
Yeah. Okay. Thank you
there
so
are
much.
about as many male as female managers, I think, in
Yeah.
most countries. That didn't really play a role there.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Victor.
Thank you.
Okay, Ocha, do you have any other question, or we can move to other participant here?
Perhaps you can continue with the other question. I think one there is in the chat box.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ocha. Have a fun over there.
Yeah, so
Thank
in the
you.
chat, oh, sorry.
No.
In the
Okay.
chat, I see the question of Octaviani, which
Mhm.
relates closely to the last question from Ocha, right? We use these very general terms, the manager, a person, the friend, rather than a specific name. And indeed, we do that because specific names can induce and these are unpredictable. So if I would use a specific name, and sometimes I do that because it makes the scenario a little bit more lively, right? If you really think about a person, then I would always deliberately look for a name that is quite average and that doesn't have any specific connotations. Right? For some names, I don't know how this is in Indonesia, but I guess it's the same as as here, for example. Certain names are more common among certain types of people, for example, among rich people or people with certain backgrounds or something. You don't want these kind of things to play a role when people answer your what I did recently when I wanted to use real names, I just looked up what are the most common names of a person who was born exactly 30 years ago, because I wanted people to imagine someone of the age of around 30s, and I just looked up what were the most common names in the year for babies born in the year 1995, and that was the most common name that I that came out that I used for that scenario. But also for this question, it's amazing if you see how much research uses vignettes and scenarios, but many of these important design questions, including specific character names, we know very little about whether that matters at all. That's something that is open for research.
Okay. Does it answer your question, Bu Okta? Or do you still have some want to have some discussion? Okay, so I invite another question. Anyone? We have 120 participants here in Zoom. So why no one
That's a lot.
ask question? Oh, okay. Thank you very much. This is a new question. Okay. You're welcome, Bu Okta. Okay, now we have another question here in the chat box.
Yeah. No, I see the question from Ia. This goes to the very heart of our study. We thought it would. I think that is the concern. You have issues, corruption, bribery, tax evasion. Sure, they are sensitive in Indonesia, but also elsewhere in the world. But so is earnings management. So is maybe giving a loan to a friend, even though their company doesn't meet the criteria. That is sort of, yeah, it's all in the same area. So this is exactly why this self-censoring that you mentioned, this social desirability bias, that people use third-person scenarios to take care of that. Yeah, what can I say? We try to see whether that takes care of the issue. We don't find any evidence that it does, and that's yeah, that's the way it is. And for us, the results were also surprising. I mean, I guess we thought that we would now, for once and for all, establish that using a third person frame would indeed take care of social desirability bias. But yeah, the evidence across the two experiments simply isn't convincing that it really does. And with the first experiment, our concern was, okay, maybe we didn't make the scenario sensitive enough, taking $100 from that you found, pocketing that for spending. Maybe that wasn't sensitive enough. People still find it overall acceptable. So then we use the second scenario where we do find indeed that it is sensitive and people think they shouldn't do it, but we still see that there's no convincing evidence that sensitivity matters to influence the framing effects, because we see the same framing effect in a completely morally neutral situation. But this is, in the end, we need to do more research, at least one more study, I think, to answer some of the open questions that we have. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much for the answer. Okay, does it answer the question?
It probably doesn't because
Yeah.
I cannot really answer it. There's so much, right? We need to, I
Yeah.
just,
Okay. No
this is
worry.
what we wanted to know.
Yeah.
But
It's just a thought. It's just a opinion. Okay. Okay. Thank you very much for your questions. Any other questions? Maybe you want to raise your hand or drop a question in the box. No? Oh, okay. Bu Ocha again.
Sorry, is that okay? I'm
No
just
problem.
thinking
As
about
long as there
another
is
else.
no other question.
Okay, Victor. So I'm just wondering, in your research delegation with you for the second experiment where you use, the second framing, do you also capturing the post-experimental questions and then try to test the mediation moderated as well, just like in the first experiment, or not?
uh, I don't remember that. I would need to look up
Oh,
the
okay, okay,
paper.
okay.
Uh,
So
yeah,
it might be interesting, to know whether the process mechanism is the same as well, whether we use the second or third framing,
third
about
person.
so, but I don't find any explanation about the process mechanisms in your second, or maybe it's just the same, so maybe you not explain them again, so maybe that makes sense as well. But then, yeah, I'm sorry, I'm just
Yeah, probably
wondering.
when we wrote it up, we kept it short, but it's I find if I generalize your question a little bit, whether the processes that happen if people answer a third person versus a second person scenario, whether the mental processes that happen in people's minds in the way that they reason about the scenario, whether that is also fundamentally different if you are in a second person versus a third person situation. That's an important and fascinating issue that I think we also know nothing about, basically. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Victor.
Okay, thank you very much. So my last invitation for all. Hello, Bapak Ibu. Hello, guys, everyone. Oh, okay, here. We have Vera Oktari here. Okay. Oh, it seems one of my student here. Okay. Mbak Vera, okay.
Ya, Ibu Alfa, makasih Ibu.
Can you open your camera?
Sorry, I cannot
Okay,
now.
no problem. As long as you can speak clearly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Mrs. Alfa. Good afternoon, Prof. Maas.
Hello, Vera.
Yes, actually, I'm currently running an experiment, and actually, this is my first time, so I need more insight, especially from you. And maybe I have a question, but so sorry because my question is very technical. I found out that normality and homogeneity test is very crucial for the experimental study. But when I try to do it, my data said that the data is heterogeneity. So, what do you think about the hypothesis testing? Because the homogeneity test is not, I didn't get the homogeneity data. Thank you.
Yeah, it is a bit of a technical question, right? So there are statistical tools that you can use to address this concern. I wouldn't worry too much about normality of your data within an experimental cell. If you're going to have a small sample, and with small I mean anything below 100, which is already very large for an experiment, you're often going to find that there's no perfect normal distribution in the data. But I think the standard procedures that we use for analyzing data, like ANOVA, are pretty robust there. So I personally, I don't worry about it too much. If you find heterogeneity in the variance, so I guess that's what you have here. Yeah, there are also ways of addressing that statistically. So um, would look into that, and I wouldn't worry about it too much. I think this often happens, and sometimes people don't even report it. So unless the and there's a strong deviation, so from the heterogeneity, from the homogeneity assumption, yeah, you just are unlikely to find any support for your hypothesis, even though it's maybe there. But again, you can take care of that. It's not too much of an issue, I would say.
Okay, thank you very much, Prof. Maas. Terima kasih, Bu Alfa.
Okay, that's all. Mbak Vera, do you have any other question?
Sudah kayaknya, Bu.
Sudah. Okay. Maybe can I add a question, yeah, from Bu Vera here. It's about the hypothesis in experiment. Okay, when we test the hypothesis, should we always use ANOVA analysis or ANCOVA analysis, or can we also use a regression analysis, Prof. Mas?
Yeah, it's essentially the same thing, right? So if you have manipulation at two levels, right, then you have a 0, 1 variable as your independent variable. So if you're going to run a regression or an ANOVA, you're going to get the exact same result, depending, of course, on the coding that you use in your regression. But if you would use effect coding rather than dummy coding in your regression, you'll get the exact same thing, because it's essentially the same linear model that you're applying. So that's yeah, doesn't matter. Sometimes if you have also maybe a measured independent variable that you want to interact with your manipulation, then you need to use regression, even because a continuous variable, yeah, you cannot interact a continuous variable with manipulation in an ANOVA setting, a traditional factorial ANOVA, I mean.
Okay, thank you very much for the great answer, Prof. Mas. Okay, so we come to the end of our sessions. Unfortunately, not all questions. Yeah, not many questions today, but yeah, we are happy that we have a lot of participants here, more than 100, Professor. So give applause to
Yes,
us.
I'm impressed. Thank you all for attending. I appreciate it, and that's very nice.
Yeah. Okay, at this moment, I would like to say a big thank you to Professor Victor Maas for being here, giving us a lot of thought, a lot of sharing, a lot of deep story, yeah, about the experiment. I think this will be very useful for us. Okay. Before I close, can I give some closing statement here, because I've already prepared here. Okay. My closing statement is that don't give up doing your research, okay? Because sometimes, even though we are fail, yeah, trying or doing trial and doing error, even an error and trial itself actually is already a experiment. Is that correct, Professor?
Absolutely, yeah, I couldn't agree more. Yeah.
It's an experiment of your research. Okay, don't give up, everyone. So see you next time in the next GR. Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you very much for all for
Thank
the
you, Alpha. Thank you
discussion.
all for attending.
Thank
Okay,
And
you.
nice
bye
evening.
everyone.
Thank you, Bu Alfa. Bye. Thank you, Victor.
Bye.
Thank you, Victor.